I just think, just to follow on Robert's points about the slavery reparations, I think Lenny Henry's demand for the UK to pay £18 trillion in slavery reparations was very much in keeping with his comedy background, put it that way. Uh, but no, but firstly, I'd like to thank everyone for attending this session. It's great to see so many familiar faces, in particular. I think the question of is patriotism back? Is nation state politics back? I think in some ways it never went. It never disappeared, the patriotism. I think what we did see for a long time were these models of sanctioned patriotism or permissible patriotism, where you had what I'd consider to be a progressive liberal political establishment, but just not in politics, but in other spheres of British life, especially the media, where certain forms of patriotism, or rather certain shapes of patriotic expressions, they were seen as more palatable. And I think that that's something to be said about the kind of culture which is developed, and the fact that now what we are seeing is we are seeing a counter challenge to that, a cultural counter challenge, in the shape of what I'd consider to be a quiet English revolution, I'd say. And I think that just to look at why we are seeing that now, and why I think a large chunk of the population, especially in England, are just genuinely fed up, is because it's something that Professor Kaufman, Eric, who actually co-examined my PhD thesis, he's talked about he's talked about a great deal. In this country, we don't really have multiculturalism. What we have is this sort of asymmetrical model of multiculturalism, where you have ethnic minorities, if they express pride in their national heritage, their ancestral origins, and indeed their religious affiliation, non-Christian religious affiliation, this is celebrated. This is promoted across a variety of public institutions, while we've not necessarily seen that enthusiasm in terms of promoting and celebrating British identity within those institutions, but specifically English identity. I think there's been that squeamishness for some time. And I think that doesn't necessarily relate to Scottish identity or Welsh identity even. I think that in some ways the progressive liberals are far more comfortable in terms of promoting those specific types of patriotism in those respective home nations. And I think what we have to say that England is quite different to Scotland and Wales. The reality is that the vast majority, and England is by far the largest populated home nation. But if you're looking at those forms of ethnic, racial and religious diversification, it's specific parts of England, especially the inner cities, but also a number of post-industrial towns, which have really witnessed those processes of, in some cases, massive demographic change. And I think for some time, I'm glad that now, in a way, that the Overton window on these matters of immigration, integration, identity, it has shifted. And I think it's important that you have to talk about, how cultural demographic change, how some people may feel anxious about it. And I don't think that's necessarily rooted in racism and xenophobia. I think in some ways that's a very natural response. And I don't think that when you look at progressive liberal celebrities such as Gary Neville, for example, who I admired a lot, 85 international caps, a fantastic right back for England. But I thought his reaction to the synagogue attack, the Islamist terrorist attack in Manchester, was so revealing. He started talking about angry, middle-aged, I believe he even used the term white men. And I just thought, this is a remarkable response. And he's just so boastful of the idea that he tore down the national flag on one of his construction sites. And I think that what's really problematic here is that there are some cases where people are just avoiding the obvious to actually what are the greatest threats to our, so if you call it modern, multi-ethnic nation, which quite often, now of course, I'm not trivializing the threat of far-right ethno-nationalism, absolutely not. But one of the gravest threat, the most significant threat, is in the form of Islamist extremism. If you're talking about the threat to freedom of expression in particular, which is a very classic liberal democratic freedom that we enjoy in England, well, we should enjoy in England. And I think that what we have to do, we have to have a very honest debate about what are threatening those sort of the traditions, the heritage, and indeed the history of England in particular. And I think I've been asked a great deal about Operation Raise the Colours, how some people find it hugely provocative, they find it intimidating. And I could tell you now, I'm someone, I grew up in Luton, where the English Defence League was created shortly after the Butchers of Basra Islamist demonstrations. And I think that the reality is that if you find the Union flag or indeed the St. George's Cross intimidating, I don't think that the answer to that is removing the flags from the public domain. I think it's more about reevaluating your relationship with those flags. I think that's an important point to make. And I think just without being too self-indulgent, I'll just talk about my own patriotism. That for me, I think too far there's been this culture of almost self-doubt, self-flagellation, which we need to do away with. That we really do. We have to put an end to that, because I think if I'll talk about this golden package that, you know, being a member of a racial, ethnic, and religious minority. If you talk about this golden package of economic opportunities, religious freedoms, political rights, legal protections, and general social stability, I don't think there's any other place that I'd rather live than here. That's the truth of it. And I think that it would be nice if I saw more ethnic minority politicians actually dig into why they are actually patriotic. You know, and I think that would be a very compelling argument to make. So I think overall it is patriotism back. I don't think it really left. I think that people are becoming more assertive now in terms of expressing their patriotism. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And I think we do need to have a greater focus on the nation state, because I think where we're in at the moment is almost this sense of sort of post-national governance. I think that we have a government, and you know, to admit one of my many sins, my natural party is the Labour Party. If you look at my voting record, I've traditionally voted Labour. But it's almost like it's almost a sense that national security doesn't even exist under this government. They don't even have an understanding that the national security is actually something that you should prioritise in the government agenda. So I would just wrap up very quickly. I'm developing this concept where you have sort of 5 fundamentals. I think it's a good starting point where we can really shore up our sort of, you know, our multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multi-racial society, whatever you want to call it, really. And I think one thing, there has to be a foundational belief that Britain has done more good than harm in the world. I think we had this debate, Rob already touched upon it, about slavery. I think quite often a lot of the discussions I've seen on it have been hugely skewed. I think there's very little talk about the sacrifice that the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron made, for example, in terms of patrolling waters. And they still do that in a tribute to the West Africa Squadron at great cost as well, because the reality, if people have even a decent understanding of it, is that the slave ships were vastly more sophisticated and well equipped. So there was a significant economic and human cost to the Royal Navy. Now, there's no avoiding the matter of immigration here. And I think that if you want to have a diverse society which is stable and secure, you need to have an immigration system which is defined by quality and quantity control. At the moment, we have neither. That's the truth of it. And I also think that we need to do away with these sort of American-inspired narratives of England being a land of immigrants. England is certainly not a land of immigrants in the same way the United States is, and I'm very surprised how that's so deeply rooted in some institutions. I think also in terms of looking at the nation state, I think in terms of naturalization and citizenship, I think that should be a lot tougher, those pathways. And I think that they should be heavily reliant on character testimonies from, you know, respected members of local communities that don't belong to the same ethnic and religious background of the applicant. I think there needs to be genuine proof of genuine and meaningful integration before you are naturalized. I'd also say that, and there's something that, you know, there's no surprise that people who are very familiar with my work would know that I'm fairly socially conservative. And I think it's something that Robert touched upon. I think that we have a tradition of historic individualism. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that personal freedom is something that we should be proud of. But I think that the governments and many public institutions, when they're making key decisions, I think they need to bear in mind the impact it will have on families. I think that for me, you know, from a more traditionalist perspective, I think that if you really want to go on that sort of process of national healing, if you want to call it that, I think we need to put the family at the heart of key decisions. For me, it's the fundamental unit of analysis. And last but not least, I'll make this very final point. In terms of the nation state, I think that there has to be rooted in the idea that you have robust border security. At the moment, we do not have that at all. That's at the core of being a nation state. I'll make this very final point that if you care about the welfare state, you care about its sustainability, that ultimately rests on a degree of demographic stability and having a stable population. And I will leave that there.
Thank you very much.